Ever feel like,
You need a law degree to understand, like, all this stuff that's happening in the news.
mm,
Today.
we're handing you those metaphorical robes.
All right.
We are diving deep.
Into the U.S. legal system
Okay.
by dissecting a real court order.
From the case of Mathew Peters versus Abby Johnson et al. Think of it like getting a peek behind the curtain of a legal drama,
Yeah.
but with real-world implications.
And what makes this deep dive particularly fascinating
Because then we're not just like talking about
some,
Right.
abstract legal theory. We're analyzing
a specific moment in a real case.
exactly. And it's a case that
Touches on family law, child welfare, constitutional rights,
Yeah.
all wrapped up in one.
we're kind of zeroing in on a court order.
That tackles two crucial motions.
On one side,
We have Defendant Patrick Stevens.
trying to get a part of the lawsuit thrown out before it even gets to trial.
Right. A classic motion to dismiss.
He's essentially arguing that the plaintiff, Mathew Peters, hasn't presented a strong enough case to even, warrant proceeding.
And on the other side, we have Mathew Peters himself.
Making a strategic move to streamline his lawsuit with a motion to remove.
A defendant named Thomas Hess.
It's like a legal chess match,
Yeah.
with each side making these calculated moves to gain an advantage.
Absolutely.
So, to set the stage for you, Mathew Peters is suing multiple defendants,
Okay.
including Patrick Stevens,
Stemming from an Arizona Department of Child Safety investigation.
that led to the termination of his parental rights.
And within this lawsuit,
Peters alleges some serious claims, including civil rights violations,
under 42 U.S. Code, Section 1983.
violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and violations of his rights under the First, Fifth, and 14th Amendments.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But we're focusing on this particular court order.
So this gives us
A direct look at how the judge ruled.
on these two specific motions. And that, my friend, is where things get really interesting.
It is, because by analyzing the judge's decisions,
We can start to understand the legal standards at play.
how they're applied in a real-world scenario.
It gives us a framework for understanding not just what happened, but why it matters.
Okay, so let's start with Defendant Stevens and his motion to dismiss.
For those of us who aren't legal eagles,
Right.
what's the purpose of filing such a motion?
Imagine this. You're served with a lawsuit,
And you believe some.
or even all of the claims against you are completely baseless.
A motion to dismiss.
Gives you a chance to say, hold on, Judge.
This case shouldn't even go any further because there's not enough evidence here.
The legal arguments don't hold water.
So essentially,
It's a way to potentially stop a lawsuit in its tracks.
exactly.
Right.
And there are very specific rules for when and how you can file a motion to dismiss.
In this case, Stevens is using Rule
This
12b-6.
is the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, which
That's a mouthful.
it is.
It boils down to this. For a claim to survive, the plaintiff has to allege enough facts.
To state a plausible claim for relief.
Okay, so what does that mean?
In plain English.
It means that Peters can't just make these vague accusations.
He needs to lay out specific facts that, if true,
Would actually support his claims.
right.
And here's the catch.
For the purpose of this motion, the court has to assume.
That everything Peters is alleging is true.
Right.
Even if Stevens believes otherwise.
Interesting.
So even if Stevens thinks Peters' claims are completely bogus,
Yeah.
at this stage, the judge is essentially saying,
Let's pretend they're true and see if they hold up legally.
that's a great way to put it. It's a very low bar for the plaintiff to clear at this stage.
Right.
The judge is just focused on whether the claims, if true, would actually be legally actionable.
Got it. So in this case, Stevens is trying to get these ADA.
And Section 1983 claims tossed out.
Right.
Let's tackle them one by one.
What's Stevens' argument against the ADA claims?
So Stevens is making a strategic argument here. He's saying that under the ADA,
You typically sue the public entity itself.
not individuals.
So is he essentially claiming...
Like he was acting as an individual, separate from his role at the Department of Child Safety.
Precisely.
He's arguing that even if there were ADA violations,
By people he supervised, he shouldn't be held personally responsible just because of his position.
that makes sense. So that's the ADA argument in a nutshell. Now, what about Section 1983?
That one sounds a bit more intense.
It can be.
Section 1983 is a very powerful tool
That allows you to sue government officials.
if you believe they violated your constitutional rights.
And Peters is alleging that Stevens, as a government official, violated his constitutional rights.
By not acting on those alleged violations by other DCS workers.
That's the crux of his argument.
Okay.
But here's where things get a bit tricky. Supervisory liability under Section 1983.
Isn't automatic.
It's not enough to simply say,
He's the boss. He should known.
right.
So what would Peters need to prove to establish that Stevens was liable?
Under Section 1983.
He would need to demonstrate that Stevens was either personally involved in the violation,
Meaning he, actively participated in the violation itself?
which seems unlikely in this case.
Right.
Yeah.
Based on what we know from the court order.
So the other route that Peters would have to take
Is to show a direct causal connection.
between Stevens' actions or inactions
Right.
and the violation itself.
This often hinges on demonstrating that the supervisor was deliberately indifferent to the violation.
Deliberate indifference. That sounds serious.
What does that entail?
It means Peters would need to show that Stevens was aware of the alleged violations.
And consciously chose to disregard them.
Right.
This could involve
Demonstrating a pattern of behavior.
Right.
Or presenting evidence that Stevens was explicitly informed about the violations, but chose not to act.
So it's about proving a conscious disregard for constitutional rights.
Not just negligence or oversight.
And establishing deliberate indifference is no easy feat.
It requires compelling evidence
Right.
and persuasive legal arguments.
Okay. I think I'm starting to grasp the nuances of deliberate indifference.
And that's crucial in this case, because Peters does present some arguments to support his Section 1983 claims.
Oh, really? What does he put forward?
Well, Peters alleges he sent Stevens emails detailing the alleged violations, but Stevens didn't take any action.
So he's arguing Stevens was directly informed and chose to ignore the issue.
Exactly. And to strengthen his case, Peters also claims he sent a letter through his attorney about allegedly fraudulent evidence being used. But again, there was no response or action from Stevens.
So Peters is building a narrative of Stevens being aware of potential violations and doing nothing about it.
Precisely. He's trying to establish that pattern of deliberate indifference.
Yeah.
But here's where the judge poked some holes in Peters' argument.
Oh.
The judge pointed out two major weaknesses in Peters' argument. The first is the timing of those emails and the letter Peters informed Stevens after the alleged violations already happened.
So it becomes harder to prove Stevens' inaction directly caused the violations if they already occurred.
Right. It weakens that causal connection the judge needs to see. And the second weakness circles back to those ADA violations we discussed earlier.
I'm sensing a connection here.
The judge pointed out that you can't sue a state official in their individual capacity under Section 1983 for violating ADA rights.
So even if Peters' ADA claims were completely valid, they wouldn't be grounds for a Section 1983 claim against Stevens as an individual.
Exactly. It's a complex legal intersection, but the judge is basically saying these two issues are distinct in this context.
This is why we need legal experts because, wow, this is a lot to wrap your head around.
It definitely highlights the intricacies of the legal system. But that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating.
Right. Absolutely. We're getting a front row seat to the legal matrix. So after considering all these arguments, what did the judge ultimately decide about Stevens' motion to dismiss? Was it a slam dunk win for him?
Well, not quite. The judge's ruling was more nuanced than a simple yes or no. They actually granted part of the motion and denied part of it.
Wait a minute, this is getting even more intriguing. A partially granted motion. What does that even look like in practice?
It means the judge agreed with Stevens on some points, but not on others. Specifically, the judge dismissed Count Exley of the complaint, which was directly related to Stevens' alleged liability. However, and this is crucial, it was dismissed without prejudice.
I've heard that term before, without prejudice. It sounds important. What are the implications here?
It's a very significant distinction. Without prejudice means that while Count Exley is dismissed for now, it's not gone forever.
So it's not a complete victory for Stevens. He dodges a bullet for the moment, but isn't entirely off the hook.
That's exactly right. And this is where that legal chess match gets really interesting. Dismissal without prejudice means Peters has the option to refile that part of the lawsuit. He just has to make changes to address the weaknesses the judge identified.
So it becomes a strategic dance. Peters needs to refine his arguments and come back stronger, while Stevens gets a preview of Peters' strategy.
Precisely. And this highlights a really important aspect of the legal system. It's a process. There are twists and turns, and things aren't always final. One ruling can significantly impact the direction of the case.
It's like a legal thriller unfolding in real time. Now, what about Peters' motion to remove Thomas Hess from the lawsuit? That seemed like his own strategic play.
You're right. Remember, Peters initially filed this lawsuit against multiple defendants, including Arizona Attorney General Thomas Hess. It seems he decided to streamline his case and focus his energy elsewhere.
So he was basically saying, I'm dropping this particular defendant from my case for now.
That's essentially it, and the judge granted that motion, meaning Hess is no longer a party to this specific lawsuit.
That's interesting. Why do you think the judge allowed that? It seems unusual to be able to just remove someone from a lawsuit after it's already been filed.
You're right, it's not automatic. But courts generally prefer to allow amendments to lawsuits unless there's a good reason not to.
So what would be a good reason in this context?
For example, if allowing the amendment would unfairly harm another party or significantly delay the case, the judge might say no.
So it's about ensuring fairness for everyone involved.
Exactly. In this case, it seems, the judge decided removing Hess wouldn't cause any major problems for the remaining parties or the case itself.
So removing Hess simplifies things for Peters without really impacting the core issues of the case.
That's a good way to look at it. And it's worth noting, even though Hess is out of the picture for now, that doesn't mean Peters can't sue him separately later on if he chooses to.
So it's more of a strategic retreat than a complete surrender.
Precisely. It adds another layer of intrigue to this already complex case.
We've covered so much ground already, from dissecting motions to dismiss, to unraveling the complexities of supervisory liability, and even witnessing a plaintiff strategically maneuvering through the legal landscape.
And we're not done yet. This deep dive has more twists and turns to uncover.
So we've seen how the judge ruled on these two motions. But what does all of this mean for Mathew Peters and his case moving forward?
Well, it's important to remember that this case is still in its early stages.
Right. We're just getting a glimpse into one particular moment in a larger legal battle.
Exactly. And this court order gives us some key clues about what to expect moving forward. The judge has given Peters a chance to refile that dismissed count against Stevens.
So it sounds like the judge isn't closing the door on Peters' claims against Stevens. He's just asking for a bit more clarity and justification.
Precisely. It'd be interesting to see what arguments Peters comes back with to address the weaknesses the judge highlighted.
And for those of our listeners who are now completely hooked on this legal thriller, what's one thing they should keep in mind as they follow this case or others like it?
Pay attention to the strategic interplay between the parties involved. Lawsuits are like chess matches. Each move has consequences and can dramatically impact the outcome.
So we're not just observing a case, we're witnessing a strategic battle of legal minds.
Exactly. This case is far from over. The next move is up to Mathew Peters. We'll be watching closely to see how he chooses to play his hand.
That's a great takeaway to leave our listeners with. Pay attention to the strategies, the twists and turns, the chess moves as this case plays out. It's a reminder that the law is a dynamic process, not a static set of rules.
And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, isn't it? We're not just learning about legal concepts, we're watching them unfold in real time.
Indeed. And we're learning that even seemingly simple legal concepts like motion to dismiss or dismissal without prejudice can be extremely complex and impactful when they're applied in a real-world legal battle.
Precisely. It adds a whole new dimension to the way we see legal proceedings.
I'm already starting to feel like a legal scholar myself. This deep dive has truly given us a window into the complexities of the U.S. legal system, and I'm excited to see what unfolds next in this case.
As are we. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and don't forget, even the seemingly simple can be a gateway to a world of fascinating insights.